Well, as Sally said, a very warm welcome to this session. For those of you who don't know, it is Longevity Week, and it's also important announcements around the ageing of our society, both globally. I think the news was that there are 8 billion people now of pensionable age right across the world, but more significantly in local to home in the UK, we're seeing a greater number of people over the age of 65. And in fact, one of the figures I always remember is that by 2050, 50% of the population will be over 50. So we are sort of seeing a real significant demographic shift. And with that in mind, we're really pleased that we're able to put this happy hour session on with you around older people's care in housing, a manifesto for change. And indeed, we do need a manifesto for change. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from our colleagues, Rebecca and Kirsty, about this programme that they've been working on in partnership with their partners. But also it coincides with an announcement tomorrow of the autumn statement, where we're waiting with bated breath about what issues are going to come through around funding social care. And some of this is around how we enable people to live more independently with access to care and support, both personal care, and also making sure that there's greater resilience in our system. And it seems that the cost of living crisis that we're currently under really means that social care is a lot more under the spotlight, whether it's from services to workforce to more personalisation of services, and making sure we have increased choice. So delighted that we got a stellar cast for you. I do have one word of disappointment in that some of our partners today, in particular our colleagues from the University of Bristol, are unable to join us due to ill health. And we've just found out as we were coming on to air that the video that Housing 21 has sent us to be aired, we just cannot get the audio to work, and we've been struggling behind the scenes to get that further progress. If we do manage it during the course of the session, we will show it. Otherwise, we'll be sending the link out with the notification of the video and the recordings and the PowerPoints of this session. But rather than me talking for the next hour or so, I'm going to pass on to our friends at Altair, who pulled this work together, and I'm delighted that Kirsty and Rebecca can join us. I do know that their PowerPoints are working, so we do have something to say. And Kirsty, you kindly said you might say a few words about what you know from the work that Housing 21 are doing as well, just to give us a flavour, so that those people who are listening in and watching in can pick that up when we send those out tomorrow. So over to you. And I think, Rebecca, you're kicking off.
Yes, thank you very much, Jeremy. I will just share my slides. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, all good. So good afternoon to you all. My name is Rebecca Howe and I'm a graduate consultant at Altair, and I was part of the core team for this research alongside my colleague Kirsty, who is just going to introduce herself quickly.
Hello, thanks Rebecca. I'm Kirsty Hickson. I am a consultant at Altair, and as Rebecca said, work jointly with her and a wider team and our partners on the research.
So thanks, Kirsty. Today we are both here to talk to you about our older people's care in social housing, a manifesto for change. And I'm going to kick off today by briefly introducing our research and begin to set the scene for Kirsty, who will give us a taste of our manifesto. We launched our research, Older People's Care in Social Housing, a Manifesto for Change, in June this year, alongside our sponsors, Housing 21, Guinness and Devonshires. The purpose of this research was to understand the role of social housing providers in the delivery of social care, their motivations, and what we could learn to help the sector. During the course of our research, we spoke to a range of key players, including the HousingLIN, who have kindly invited us here today to promote the vital role that housing associations play. So before we begin, just a quick introduction to Altair, for anyone who doesn't know. Altair is a consultancy that works across the social housing sector in both the UK and internationally. We advise on all areas which contribute to a well-governed and well-run social housing management service. And ultimately, at Altair, we aim to actively contribute to the better outcomes of tenants through our insight and innovation. And our Manifesto for Change is no different. So the goals for our research were threefold mainly. Firstly, we wanted to fully understand the context of the operating environment and the public policy landscape. Then we wanted to answer a number of key questions about the why and the how, because although we know within the sector that many providers care and vitally support their residents as they age, alongside their core housing offer, we felt that this is a largely unrecognised role, especially in the wider social care landscape and political landscape. To accompany this, we really wanted to explore best practice examples, both in the UK and internationally, to understand those success factors. And then in line with those success factors and the people at the heart of care white paper, we developed a manifesto for change, which Kirsty will talk through shortly. In answer to why we feel housing associations provide care, there are largely two main paths they take. Most RPs who provide care either do so from a historical community route or do so as a result of the rollback of the state. But regardless of the route into providing this service, throughout our research, amongst the many risks and challenges noted by providers, there was a fundamental commitment to delivering care services and a core recognition at the wider societal impacts providers have. Many providers told us that care is part of their DNA and is something that many of them have always done. But given the financial constraints and pressures we all know providers are facing, what does that look like now? Well, overall, providers play a significant role in the provision and management of specialist social housing, and overall, registered providers provide over 1 million housing for older people homes, which accounts for around 10% of the social housing stock. Now, although all providers provide vital support to their residents as they age, not all providers provide regulated care. And in the UK, RPs deliver around registered care to around 20,000 people a day, which represents around 4% of the regulated care sector. Now, 4% may not sound like a lot, but it is a crucial role to the residents that those communities and providers serve. Our research has shown, however, that despite an increase in demand, the number of homes for older people is decreasing, and the number of providers who provide regulated care is also decreasing, as many are unable to make care financially work any longer. Throughout our research, we were able to map the variety of care options available in the social care market for older people. As you can see on the diagram on the screen, we have categorised the provision into two areas. So on the left-hand side are the services and provisions that allow older people to age in place. From our research, we know that care at home and intergenerational living are already provided by registered providers, but we have also understand that providers are exploring new options, including co-housing and home share arrangements, as well as others, to enable their residents to age in place. Then, on the right of this diagram is the specialist accommodation, and it is where social housing landlords are significant providers in both retirement living and extra care facilities across the UK to both their own social housing tenants, but also to leaseholders. And then, as you can see in this diagram, integral to all the options now is the emerging and growing role of technology to assist people as they age and help them maintain independence. Our research showed that the social housing providers represent an ecosystem of the provision, offering a broad range of care options to both their residents and products to the wider market. As I mentioned earlier, as part of our research involved looking at best practice examples of housing with care to understand how providers successfully care. We featured 4 specific case studies in our report, including Quayside, an example of integrated housing with care by Guinness, Housing 21's innovative approach and methodology to collaborative housing, Alertical's use of technology to integrate housing management and safeguarding, and finally, a case study from Devonshires about how housing providers should revise their strategies for older people regularly in line with the wider operating environment. And then finally, before I hand over to Kirsty, I'm just going to briefly talk you through the international review. The 4 countries we explored are Spain, Japan, Denmark and New Zealand. What we found is overall, the UK social care provision for older people is not dissimilar to those in other countries, but countries have responded in a number of different ways with varying degrees of capacity for investment, and there are certainly lessons the UK can learn. I'm now going to try and avoid giving you too much detail, as much as I'd like to, about each country in the hope that it might lead you to have a read of our report. But what I will do is, at this point, is note how the UK compares. So let's start with New Zealand. Unlike the UK, New Zealand is one of the most well-developed housing and care markets, with the housing and care as an integrated joint offer. Alongside strong industry governance and governmental regulation, New Zealand has been able to successfully develop a strong understanding of their housing for older people market and have been able to communicate this effectively in its products to the public. Moving on to Spain, in the UK, we know that there's been significant pressure on government budgets and social care. However, Spain, a country with significant fiscal constraint and economic challenge, has led the way with policies to embed technology as a world leader in technology-supported care. In the same way, what can we learn from Japan? As we know, the UK is known for its innovation within the social care sector, with Help to Buy, Right to Buy policy, but this is not the same for social housing with care. Whereas in Japan, a country leading innovation and research into the provision of housing with care to ensure it meets the needs of its ageing population. And then on to Denmark. Denmark is the most similar to the UK in terms of its social housing sector. As we know, in Denmark, there is a strong financial funding regime and a focus on meeting universal care needs, where, importantly, housing associations play a strong role in social care. Denmark also utilises a form of tenant democracy that emphasises that the landlord's role is to the tenant and provides tenants with a greater say over what their landlord does. From these 4 countries alone, there are many lessons and success factors that the UK could learn from. And this is where I'm going to hand over to my colleague Kirsty.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I think that you, even if I may say so myself, covered it really well. We talked a bit earlier about whether we give too much information and people then don't read the report, but hopefully we've left you just enough to leave you tempted to come and read the full report. So following on from our research into the international good practice and the good practice from within the UK, we identified some commonalities. And these commonalities appeared to create the foundations and environment for delivering a housing and care system which really worked for people. We identified 6 factors. These were a policy and legislative environment which had a clear focus on an ageing population, effective integration and planning which ensured systems joined up to deliver seamless services for individuals and their families, that there were adequate funding systems so people knew they would be supported if they needed it, including support for ageing in place. Housing providers were part of the delivery of social care, particularly in developing integrated housing and care facilities that reduced care home use. That there was a genuine choice for people offering the right amount of care in an environment that suited their needs. And finally, that technology was widely understood and used to enable independent living, and new innovations were continually invested in. Next slide, please. Thank you. This slide shows our assessment of the UK and our international case study countries against the 6 success factors. The green rating shows that the success factor was evident and in place, and amber means that there was partial evidence, and red means that it was either missing or there was inadequate evidence. As you can see, as Rebecca highlighted, that Japan and Denmark were deemed to have clear evidence for 5 out of the 6 factors, with the 6th success factor having partial evidence. By comparison, the UK didn't compare quite as well, only having clear evidence for the role of housing providers in delivering integrated housing and care options, and taking a role in the delivery of social care to varying extents. With this in mind, and with the aspiration to help shape the future of housing and care for older people, we developed a vision for the future. Concluding our research is our call to arms, a vision and a manifesto for change. This sets out a vision for housing providers' role in the adult social care sector that works in tandem with government's 10-year vision for adult social care. So we proclaim that whilst some housing providers provide care, not all providers have to, and however all providers must care, but in a number of different ways. It is a social and moral imperative for social housing providers to ensure their tenants of all ages and backgrounds have a landlord that supports them to live well within their homes. And through this research, we identified 4 goals social housing providers of all types should work towards to support tenants to live well with age. These goals require effort, partnership and commitment by all providers of social housing, both those who provide care and those that do not. We strongly believe that housing providers alongside other sectors such as health and social care can help drive improvements for long-term and sustainable options for older people. We call on the social housing providers to diligently adopt the following 4-point plan of action. The first point being around leadership. All providers must commit to take action within their organisation to enable older people to remain independently within their homes, whether as an enabler or a provider of housing with care services. They must work collectively to deliver the objectives of the social care and social housing white papers. And they must work to promote housing and care as a desirable and rewarding career to attract new people to the sector. Point 2 is around integration. So as commit to closer working with local authorities and lobbying for greater certainty over funding and incentivising growth by providing land for new housing and care developments. Providers should maximise the utilisation of their strengths, sharing this with partners to develop and deliver new solutions for older people, and work to identify and mitigate where people are falling between the cracks between housing, social care and health systems. Point 3 is around innovation. They should continue to innovate and bring better and sustainable solutions to the markets for older people to live as independently as possible, and advocate for investment through evidencing the social and economic value of housing and care. Point 4 finally is around promoting the range of housing and care options available to communities and incentivise growth by providing land for new housing and care developments, and transition to seeing being older as a stage of life and not an identity, and positioning their offer and language accordingly. So really appreciate you taking the time to listen to our presentation around the research. It was a really interesting piece of work, and we were able to speak to a wide range of people across the whole the sector, including the HousingLIN, as Rebecca mentioned earlier. We would be presenting to you next a video clip of one of our partners, Vanessa of Housing 21. Unfortunately, as Jeremy explained, we haven't been able to get the sound to play. So she had pre-recorded a short video for us to tell you a little bit about how Housing 21 are adopting the Manifesto for Change within their organisation, and pre-recorded it because they are having an away day, so Vanessa wasn't able to attend in person today. However, it's a really interesting video, so I'd really encourage you to go and watch it after the session. I think it may be online for you to watch from tomorrow, and it tells you about how Housing 21 are adopting the Manifesto for Change, and using opportunities such as the development of their academy for people joining the sector as a way to support people into the care sector as a career opportunity, and providing comprehensive support and training to ensure that people feel supported and see it as a career of choice. So I won't say too much because it would be great if you could go and watch the video. If you would like to find out a bit more about Altair's research offer, then please do not hesitate to contact my colleague Becca Ryder, whose details are on this slide. And also, should you have any questions or other queries, then you'd be really welcome to contact myself or Rebecca. Thank you so much for your time and for listening.
Oh, well, can I also thank you for such great clarity of presentation. I think both how you sort of distilled the key learning points from the report and shared that with us this afternoon is really expertly done. And I know we've already got several questions coming up in the box. Rather than us answering these now, let's move on to Alex Evan, who works with OpenAge, because I think some of the points that you highlighted from the report include, I think, so those 6 cohorts included issues around technology. And what Alex has been doing is doing a lot of things that look at both the social value of technology, but also how to connect people better and looking at how communities become more resilient. So Alex, I know you published a guest blog with us last week. Thanks very much as a little taster. I'm not sure everybody will have had a chance to read that, but here's your chance now to have the floor. As I said, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Jeremy. So let me just share my screen. Okay, is everyone seeing my screen? Yeah,
that's okay. Perfect.
Great. So first of all, just to say thank you very much indeed for inviting me, and it's really interesting to be here alongside my colleagues here from Altair, who are doing some really interesting work. And as Jeremy says, I really hope there are some sort of synergies here in terms of the things you're talking about. So I'm going to talk about the use of online group activities for older people during and since the pandemic. And these are our interim findings for now before publication in 2023. And just about me, I'm an independent consultant and researcher with a particular specialism in building community. And I'm delivering a piece of research which is commissioned by OpenAge, who are a charity based in North West London. And the project is funded by Dunhill Medical Trust and the National Lottery Community Fund. So thank you to those funders if they happen to be here. So I'll start just by telling you a bit of background and about OpenAge, who commissioned the work. So OpenAge are a membership organisation of over 4,000 older people in Northwest London who offer a wide range of group activities, most of them in person, and they never actually delivered anything online before the pandemic. But like many organisations, they had to close their face-to-face activity during the pandemic pretty much overnight. And so they set up an extensive online group activity programme of more than 100 hours a week of fully interactive group activities over Zoom. And this had a significant positive impact on the members. People described it as a lifesaver and a godsend quite regularly, and over 1,600 people accessed that regularly. And now they've continued to run online activities alongside their face-to-face activities in a hybrid form and are planning to scale up. So they commissioned this research because they wanted to inform that potential scale up. So this is a piece of in-depth qualitative research talking to older people from OpenAge and other organisations. And we wanted to understand, first of all, what were older people's experiences of using online activities and why did they do so? The impact, the benefits and the barriers, and the experiences of professionals in other older people's organisations. Did they have similar experiences in terms of running online group activities? So first of all, we talked to older people themselves, and what we wanted to do was find out what the sort of the benefits were, what the barriers were, and what actually drove them to use the activities themselves. And so we used individual interviews, group interviews, and observations of sessions. And some of the older people's observations related to lockdown, but we wanted to understand particularly why they continued to use activities after lockdown. What did they continue to get out of it? And so common themes emerged. So the first was that older people talked very compellingly about reducing loneliness and isolation. And contrary indeed to what some studies we'd seen had suggested, they felt that they had genuine social connection, a genuine sense of community, and real friendships developed in those online group activities. And this was even more the case for those who were otherwise very isolated. They spoke quite movingly of the impact it made, especially if they were housebound or living alone. A lot of older people also referred to the structure it gave them. And they talked about, rather soberingly, they talked a lot about retirement as being just endless days ahead of them with no form and no structure. And so many of them built their own program from the activities that were provided quite actively based on their own needs and preferences, often mixing in-person and online activities post-lockdown. And so they used this to actively shape their days and weeks, and said that it stopped them losing track of the days. It helped them maintain a healthy structure, stop their brains turning to mush, was what one people said. And it was especially valuable again for those who couldn't get out as much and lived alone. The other thing we saw was older people using it as a way to maintain some continuity of relationships and socialization as things in their lives changed. So for example, older people who had worsening health issues were able to continue doing things online when their mobility reduced, or when they had to move to a different place. And that made a big difference. There was some kind of constant in their activities and their social networks. One of the biggest things that older people talked about was that it provided them with choice and convenience. And I think a level of choice and convenience that we tend to take for granted, but a lot of older people tend to lose and tend not to have provided for them as they get older. And in particular, of course, it had massive impacts on their travel. So some older people were talking about not having to travel a 90-minute journey each way for an hour of exercise, for example. And the ability to mix in-person and online activities was particularly valuable for those who just wanted to have time to do more. So it meant they could have a much more active later life where they just had more fun, essentially. So we looked at a couple of user personas. Obviously, there's a whole range of different kinds of users, but we thought these were two particularly helpful personas to look at. The first is a fairly active retiree who wants to use online group activities as a way of expanding what they do to live the most active and busy life possible, and probably blends online and in-person activities to get the most out of what they're doing. And then the other one is Geeta here, who is perhaps a more isolated older person, someone who's particularly limited in terms of their mobility or has caring responsibilities. And for this offers a lifeline. It's a new option that's provided for people who have an otherwise very limited life. Obviously, between those and beyond them, there's a huge spectrum of people, but these are two particular sort of personas that came out for us. So we did, of course, also consider what the barriers were for older people not using the activities, or indeed for those who actually used them but disliked them. The first thing that put people off is exactly what you would expect. It was digital exclusion. And no one is suggesting for a moment that this isn't an issue for a large number of older people. And I won't say too much about it because it was essentially, as you'll see in the report, all sorts of the usual things about access, motivation and skills, pretty much as you would expect. Most of the organisations we talked to did do an extensive amount of digital inclusion work to combat this, and did make a lot of strides in terms of getting people who are on the cusp actually go online. But we should also note, and we noted, that the older people taking part in online group activities are not silver surfers. You know, they're not all digital enthusiasts. There was a very broad range of abilities, which came across throughout when we were talking to them. The other thing that loomed very large was a distrust of anything face-to-face moving online. Now, given that banks, shops and services have all started removing pretty much anything face-to-face and replacing it with online things, I think older people are rightly quite suspicious that this is just another thing that's going to be taken away from them. And we did find, even when we were talking to them to get them to focus on the things we were talking about, it was quite hard to reassure them if they felt negatively about them. The other thing is that for those who had tried the Zoom activities, the pain barrier of the social awkwardness of Zoom was a major barrier. And in fact, one of them pointed out that for people who were working, we'd have to force ourselves through that pain barrier. But for them, they'd never actually had to force themselves through that. Some did push through, but some did eventually find the discomfort too great. What we did notice was there was a striking difference when you asked people about whether being less mobile would change their minds if they felt negatively. And a lot of them reconsidered originally very strong negative opinions and sort of recognized the value for those who would be very isolated otherwise. So it may be that for some people it's not right for now, but it might be later or in different circumstances. So we also talked to some organizations, and there's a lot more about this in the report, but just to give you the headlines, we found organizations who had very changed opinions, people who are unsure or very skeptical before the pandemic about offering online activities have very much changed their opinion since and saw it as a great opportunity. And the key for many of them have been the space to try things out, especially with reduced restrictions for funding and charitable funding over the pandemic. So from trusts and foundations, for example, they weren't sure it would work, but trying it had answered the question for them, and that flexibility had allowed it to happen. The more rural organizations we spoke to were especially enthusiastic about the opportunities for the future, and one said that suddenly geography didn't matter, and that they were able to reach people across significant areas where transport for older people was prohibitive. One of the organizations we talked to was covering an area of around 1,000 square miles. So this was making a huge difference to them, and they do want to continue that. And the other thing that they mentioned was that there was the potential to include more people of particular types. So we talked about mobility, but organizations also noted particular benefits for carers. And we saw that a lot of carer groups have moved online. I mean, family carers here, by the way. And they were one of the most common groups to continue post-lockdown. And overall, what we found was that a hybrid mode was now an ongoing part of many organizations' services because they wanted to give older people options and preferably choice as to how they participated. In terms of barriers, we saw the usual issues you would expect with staff skills and a lack of funding to offer the services. And some did worry that without dedicated funding to continue, they may have to lose some of the ground that they gained during the pandemic. So some initial conclusions. There is an appetite for online activities for older people, and many older people are still enthusiastic users and were adamant that they did not want these things to be taken away. And we saw a good deal of potential for the future, various agendas across the whole older people's piece, but also those especially relevant for housing. So building social capital, reducing isolation and loneliness, increasing health and well-being, and increasing choice and independence. All of these things may be areas that this can have an impact on, and certainly our research suggested they could. And of course, it's clear that it's not suitable for everyone. There's no suggestion that all of the issues with digital exclusion that we're all very aware of aren't, of course, significant issues for especially older people. And there's all sorts of issues around socioeconomic class and various different things. But at the same time, for some people, this is an additional tool that can make a big difference. And then the final thing is, this should not be used to replace face-to-face. Older people will smell it coming a mile off, and they're right to be concerned about it. So really, this is something that hopefully is additional to that, unless, of course, there's no other option, in which case people will be grateful, I think, for the opportunity. So just ending there, just to say that OpenAge is looking at scaling this up. They're looking for partners to pilot an expanded service, and one of the areas they'd like to do that in is in a housing setting. So if you would like to get in touch with them, that's Ian Cassidy, their Chief Executive's email address, or indeed you can contact me. And if you'd like to find out more about the research, which will be published in early 2023, please do get in touch with me and I can talk your hind legs off if you're a donkey about the research. Yeah, would like to do so. So thank you very much indeed for inviting me, and thanks for your time.
Well, Alex, thanks ever so much. I must just let you know we don't have many donkeys watching this, but we will. But we
Maybe
will
for the future.
We will certainly share the information with your PowerPoint slides after this with the recording. But thanks ever so for that. And also, it touches on another Dunhill funded project with the HousingLIN and St Monica Trust, which looked at very early stages of COVID and the impact for the sheltered and retirement housing sector. So again, I think Sarah's on the call. So again, that's a good segue. So and I'm sure there'll be several questions in the chat box for you and others in a minute. But again, thanks to all three of you for setting out the scene, both for the manifesto, but also I think it's really timely this session because you know, I think Rebecca, you touched on in your slides the fact that there was the adult social care white paper, and in that it set out an allocated funding which we hope will be announced if it's not clawed back in tomorrow's autumn statement, which is around how to look at using some of the approaches that you've identified to invest in local communities for delivering greater partnerships with housing and care, things like the Housing Transformation Fund, the additional monies available through, we hope, through the Care and Support Specialised Housing Fund. So again, I think some of the messages that you've shared this afternoon are really excellent pointers, and I know civil servants couldn't join us this afternoon, but I know they'll be watching this again because I met with some of them yesterday. So again, how we can help inform and influence. Right, we've got a series of questions, and we might find that we finish early today, so you might buy back a bit of time. So as the evening sort of starts to draw in, I think we had some questions that actually were superseded because I think Sue asked about whether somebody asked whether you had drawn on case studies outside of England, and then you showed a slide which highlighted Spain, Japan, Denmark, and New Zealand. But Sue asked, you know, what was the reason for choosing those four countries? Any reasoning behind the scenes?
I think that we were sort of discussing with our sponsors and as a team about countries which I think were relatively known for their offer for older people, also sort of around the demographics, which made them particularly interesting. So countries which had aging populations, which may well drive them to be more innovative as well. So we hoped very much that they would be learning lessons to be learned from them, and that's certainly what we came away with. But obviously there's plenty of countries out there which I'm sure would also have made great case studies, but those were the ones that we sort of finally came down to choose.
It's interesting in that regard, and I know when we started one of the first HAPPI reports, you know, trying to identify those countries was very difficult. But what's really interesting, sort of 10 plus years on, is how much some of those principles are now embedded in our policy and our practice, whether it's around design or service delivery. So, so I know we learned a lot from Denmark and Spain, perhaps less so from New Zealand, but also I know some of the team visited Japan at the time. And again, that sort of approach to thinking about how to provide care closer to home was very much part of that equation. Sue asks a supplementary question, which is, did you talk with commissioners? And Sue, I know you're a former commissioner, so very much from the adult social care perspective, or yeah, so conversations with local authorities with commissioning functions.
We didn't actually, and I think probably would have added another dimension. We did speak with a range of different organisations, as many of which were either housing associations primarily or social care organisations that had evolved to offer accommodation and were housing providers as like a secondary But we spoke with sort of a range of bodies such as HousingLIN, but we did engage with older people as well that were living within sort of extra care and housing for older people schemes, because we wanted to make sure that actually the voices of people who actually experience these services were really integral to the report. And I had the pleasure of being able to visit Guinness's scheme in Totnes to be able to speak with people, which was fantastic, but certainly like added great value to our report and our findings.
And that's very helpful. And the second question, I think, not from Sue but from Diane, sort of builds on that. And I mean, I know the report emphasis on care is probably more on the social care, but she just questions whether regarding the changes going on from CCG's clinical commissioning groups to integrated care systems or integrated care partnership boards at the moment, are there any examples that you can pick out that might have been demonstrated the good practice between health and housing perhaps as well?
It wasn't something that we sort of went down the route of particularly. It was much more focused on housing and care particularly. I think one thing that sort of struck me was the when the integrated care systems were sort of established, and there was the I guess the mandate about who would be part of those boards, that actually there was no mandate to engage with housing beyond that recognition that you may want to engage with other voluntary sector organisations. And I was quite surprised, and I think Lord Best spoke quite regularly about the three-legged stool that health, social care and housing come together, and I was quite surprised that with that great recognition of the sort of the dependencies between those three sectors, that that they weren't sort of listed. But we didn't focus as much on the health and housing element. It was more about the housing and social care.
Thanks,
and I think
Rebecca.
I was just going to add that in the report we do touch on commissioning, but it's mainly from the perspective of a housing association and their experiences as it being a blockage in the provision of care, whether that be through funding or resources or cooperation with local authorities and the commissioning unit. So it is, as Kirsty went through the manifesto points, we do list in detail all the manifesto points with the priority RAG rated against them. And one of those points is looking at how local authorities and housing associations and providers more generally can work together to really enhance the role and deliver together really. And the report mainly is to draw the attention, because we do feel that the role of housing associations is sometimes not always as realised as is actually achieved in the sector. So I think the report really tries to shine that light on how and what we can do more of to improve commissioning and enable greater cooperation.
Oh, that's very helpful. And I just wanted to come in on that sort of broader health and housing link. If people aren't aware, the HousingLIN curates a dedicated section on our website on health and housing. It's called Health Intel, and we've got lots of examples of where housing and health are better integrated. From memory, there's the light bulb project in Leicester, and there's the Derby Healthy Housing Hub, which demonstrates if you get those connections right, not only are there improved outcomes and benefits for the residents and citizens of those localities, there are care efficiencies that can be built into the system, sometimes cash releasing, but also more often improved pathways, both in terms of diverting or reducing admissions or supporting people through speedier transfer of care. So do have a look at that if you want to look at both some of the policy context, but also some examples. And I know the National Housing Federation over the years have produced another number of reports. There's a couple of other questions, and in fact I'm going to jump because I think Kirsty and Rebecca, you answered a few to start off with, and I'll come down to others which relate a bit more to you, Alex. So Debbie asks, what is it that OpenAge are looking for from housing associations? Are you able to give a little bit more detail to that?
Sure. So I think what they're interested in doing is piloting more of their activities in a housing setting. And so looking at finding a provider who would like to work with them on actually seeing, you know, what the impact can be within a housing association of some sort. So I think that's the main thing that they're looking for is, you know, we've done some looking at the various different organisations across the UK who are doing these various things, but it will be interesting for them now to actually, you know, look at something in detail in particularly in housing settings. So that's the thing.
That's great. And I know that you may not have watched it, but a couple of months ago, we ran a happy hour session where one of the contributors was from Age Concern Camden, who are doing some really excellent work around engaging with residents, in this case in sheltered housing, as opposed to mainstream housing as well. So we've got some examples. So again, there may be some linkages there. Alex, there are a couple of other questions while we're at it. Did you pick up any latent fear or lack of confidence in using public transport going out to post-pandemic as motivations for interacting online? And again, that's from Diane.
Absolutely, yeah. So I mean, I think when we talked to the organisations, everybody talked about increased agoraphobia in general, which I think I've seen outside of this work in other organisations I've worked with as well. And I think, yeah, concerns about public transport and the fact that it was so closed in, people who are still shielding. I think, you know, people forget that there are people who are still shielding and so on. And then also concern about being in sort of public environments like centres and so on. People were concerned about that. In terms of the transport, I think what came across was just the very size of the journeys that people were undertaking. And what was quite interesting was that in a rural setting, you know, 90 minutes to come, maybe you paid for a taxi for someone who'd had a stroke, they'd come from a rural setting into the nearest town or something to do an activity. That was one thing, which of course was a major cost, either for them or the organisation. But actually, even in London, even where cost wasn't an issue, if people had to get 2 buses or, you know, do any of these things, it could take, you know, half a day to come for an hour's exercise. So really, it made a huge difference to people because transport was one of the things that they most relied on. Dial-a-ride was another thing that was mentioned often as well, sort of the fact that in some cases it's good, but in other cases it wasn't terribly reliable. So people were concerned about that too.
Well, you may want to link in with Charles Musselthwaite at University of Aberystwyth, who does a lot of work around older adults and transport research as well. So I know he's part of the UKRI Healthy Ageing Challenge, and they've run quite a few programs around looking at active ageing as well. I'll just ask, hi Martin, you've asked the question as well. Were there any activities that became more popular when provided virtually compared to face-to-face?
Yeah, there seemed to be, I think there are some particular things that really lent themselves to it. And thinking about things that had continued, singing was something that people really loved and continued. There was a lot of that happening. Fitness, you know, there's actually quite a developing kind of, a lot of fitness activity, especially chair-based exercise and so on. And the thing about those is that on the one hand, yes, people don't have to leave their houses and get the quote exercise of going out to something. But again, if it takes you an hour to get to an hour's exercise and an hour to get back, you can't do it every day. So people were able to do that every day. And the other thing, it was particularly carers groups. So suddenly people who really wouldn't be able to get out of the house at all because they couldn't stray too far from their loved one were able to actually join something online. And so that, you know, made a huge difference to people. A lot of really creative things as well, I should say. People learning soca dancing, people doing disco dancing with 1970s quizzes and so on. Just, it seemed to sort of bring out a real sort of burgeoning creativity in people, just partly seeing what the medium allowed them to do. A couple of pantomimes as well.
Oh, we lost Jeremy.
I think he was stunned when I said pantomime, maybe.
maybe he thinks that you might make him be a Dane or something.
He might well join us again. yeah, I'll see what happened there, but I'm not sure where he got to in terms of the Q&A box and which questions he's covered and which ones he hasn't. But Alex, were you halfway through answering one of your questions, or had you come to an end?
No, I think I'd come to an end.
Okay, great. Yeah, he's rebooting and we'll try and join in just a moment. Have Kirsty and Rebecca got any other comments that you'd like to make in between time?
There is a question that we could pick up. So from Marion, so she's asking, are you advocating a return to the traditional warden role in social housing for older people, in which usually a resident warden would visit each resident each morning, be available to give advice and the like? We heard through our sessions with people that for those people that lived within the extra care settings or the housing for older people, that they really valued there being people around, and I think what worked particularly well in the integrated care and housing settings was that people didn't have to worry about who they would speak to for particular things. It was easy because actually the people worked for one organisation and they knew that whoever they spoke to, that they would be able to help them. And there wasn't that sort of divide which could potentially happen with a separate care delivery provider and a separate landlord. So for instance, if somebody had a bit of a problem with a repair issue, they weren't sure if it was a repair that should be reported, then they might ask the carer. Whereas maybe if they weren't provided by the same person, you might not find that the carer felt able to give that sort of advice. And I don't think that the report recommends sort of the reintroduction of wardens, but I think that what it certainly recommended was sort of an integration in whatever the sort of the setup of the housing and care model between whoever provides the care and whoever is the landlord, whether they be one organisation just delivered by different teams or two different organisations, and that actually that working together and collectively really made a difference to people. And I think as well, through some of our international research and through exploring some of the case studies, we were able to see how some technology options now really were promoting people's independence, whereas maybe back when the wardens were around, sort of technology options just weren't sort of quite as developed. So there's definitely been options now for, I think, people's independence to be sort of developed and promoted much further than maybe they could have done back when wardens were much more commonplace.
Yeah, and then building on from Kirsty's response, Marion, I don't think we would ever advocate blanketly to increase wardens in any provision, and I don't think that, as Kirsty said, is what the report tries to do. What the report does advocate is that providers innovate and look for new solutions to meet the ageing population, and from our research we've seen a number of providers are moving away from the old warden style provision of housing for older people in favour of newer independent living schemes or that extra care facility that Kirsty touched on. So, and in the report also we look at the different archetypes of housing associations that provide care. So there is no one size fits all for all providers. It depends on the provider's operating model. It depends on their approach and their service provision as to what fits best for them. But I think what the report really advocates for is that housing associations listen to their tenants and residents and really provide the provision that is needed and most suited to their communities that they serve. So I hope that answers your question.
Hello again. I'm afraid my system crashed and I temporarily had to reboot and join you. Now, unfortunately, the problem we have is that it has also deleted all the Q&As, but I think you've just been answering sort of Marion's question about the role of warden, and I don't know whether you went on to think about respond to Ian's question about technology. So Ian from Appello has joined us this afternoon. So I'm just wondering if you could take that from memory. I don't have it to hand.
Yeah. Kirsty, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm just Ian says we Appello work closely with both Housing 21 and Guinness on their digital telecare services, and we agree that there is significant opportunity for wider use of technology. And it is interesting to see in the report that it is currently viewed that technology is used to enable services, but not as a substitute for care. In your international case studies, have you seen that technology is more of a substitute? And if so, what has been the driver for this in these regions? And do you think this is the right approach for the UK? I am happy to start answering that. I think the case study of Spain actually showed a widespread adoption of telecare services, which was, I think, partly in substitute for care, but as a very sort of preventative measure. So legislation allowed that people of a particular age would be able to have a telecare service put in, and this was engaged with and monitored people's sort of health and well-being, and was used almost to help prevent people escalating into needing sort of regular care services. But data would be sort of collected and analysed by teams of specialist health and care providers, and they would look at maybe where there was an increasing need and where they could target services. And I think that they've been really sort of well regarded for their use of technology, and so it didn't necessarily stop people from needing care sort of in the most sort of high need level cases, but certainly in maybe those lower need cases when maybe people are sort of on the sort of the borderline, it certainly seemed to be beneficial, because sometimes people maybe don't need care all of the time, and it was just a way of like actually being able to use data to sort of target when it was necessary, dependent on that individual.
Yeah. And then I would say, just building on from Kirsty's point, is that from our research with providers is that there wasn't the narrative of substituting care completely for a digital solution, and it wasn't something any of our participants felt comfortable in fully advocating in their journey. Now, as I say, it is a journey, so who knows, but we also did, as Kirsty said about the data in Spain, in one of our manifesto points is to get our providers to understand their data and think about how they use their data, of knowing their customer base and using that data to create insight and drive improvement within their service delivery for older people and care. So yes, it's definitely something that I think providers are looking at, but is relatively still not an emerging but an uncertain market. There is no single bullet that everyone likes to look for, and providers are still navigating that space and their role within technology and care. So yeah, I think we're just at the start of that journey.
Well, I know it's something also that we in the HousingLIN are really keen to explore further. Just following on from Ian's question, we worked closely with them on a report that was published about a month ago, which demonstrates some of the lack of take-up in preparation for the digital switchover between now and 25, and not by 25, but from now. So Ian, I think we'll put that into the chat box. But more fundamentally, it also links back to how we enable people to take more control over, and again, you had choice and control in some of your domains, and it's something that we're exploring with the Technology Services Association, the TSA. Some of you will be familiar with our TAPPI project, the Technology for an Ageing Population Panel for Innovation. And we've just in the last 6 weeks or so started working on the testbed. So do follow us on the TAPPI project as we take that forward. Alex, have you got any other answers on the tech piece? You're muted, yeah. Sorry, you were muted. You're not muted now.
Okay, so I've unmuted to say no.
Oh, you said no. Okay. Right, that's fine.
No,
Well,
I don't have anything else to add. I didn't have any
okay.
other questions, but thanks for having me.
Okay, no, well, I've got to conclude then. There's, I think there's one final question that we haven't responded to, and that's from Sarah. Our care partners are facing huge issues with the recruitment and retention of good quality care staff. Did this issue become evident in your discussions with housing associations?
Very much so. I think in some cases, organisations were having to sort of operate at a loss for some of their services, but because of their commitment to those particular customers that they were providing care to, as their not only their tenants but also then as their sort of their customers of the care service, they subsidised some of their services just because they wanted to deliver excellent quality services and they felt best placed to deliver them. And also, as I was saying earlier about sort of that more seamless service, that actually it was one organisation that was delivering both. It sort of made that easier for them as an organisation, but also for the people that were receiving those services, that actually that they knew that the organisation was somebody that was already familiar and that they could raise sort of a repair with the carer, or you know, call the organisation's sort of customer services and be able to get a message through to the care service. So it was sort of doubly beneficial for them, but also I think there was also from a housing provider's perspective that desire to manage risk as well, because reputationally, but also from the perspective of people's well-being and safety, they felt that they had greater control over the quality of services that were delivered to people. I'm not sure if I've really sort of answered the question, but certainly yes, just recruitment and retention were certainly issues that they were experiencing, like the wider social care sector.
But I think, Kirsty, also that links back to the point about why Housing 21 are set up an academy as well. So looking at this from a career pathway, you know, this is about care as your main job, not because of the cost of living crisis and having it to top up your income. You know, this is actually thinking about this as a professionalism, you know, not just a vocation as well. So any final thoughts from Rebecca or Alex on this? Or any other points that you feel you want to sort of share as concluding remarks from today's happy hour?
I think for me, just it's sort of an interesting thing to consider what people were saying before about just the sort of creativity in terms of the things that I was talking about that people are sort of able to do. And I think the opportunities that technology provides for people to actually innovate and think about different ways of doing things, which sort of gives them opportunities, as I say, to think more creatively. So I think that was the only thing about that, but also just hugely interested to hear what people are saying from the Altair research as well.
Well, thank you. And Rebecca and Kirsty, last words.
I think we just really encourage people to get in touch if they've got any questions, and hopefully people take the time to read the report and to follow up with Vanessa's short video, where you can hear about how Housing 21 are adopting and implementing the Manifesto for change within their organisation. And just a thank you for allowing us to come along, and for everybody for listening today.
Same, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for your giving up your time, both people who are watching, but also in particularly to our presenters, Rebecca, Kirsty and Alex. It was a shame that we couldn't be joined by our friends at the University of Worcester, and for the technical glitch. I myself had a technical glitch. I had a very sudden rain shower which just knocked everything out, so so it just shows technology doesn't always work all the time. But I just want to conclude by thanking our sponsors for enabling us to put this session on, thanking our speakers, as I said, and to Sally behind the scenes for covering for me as I sort of fell out of online. If this is the first time that you've been part of one of our happy hour sessions or joined in to watch and listen, we try and run these every week or every other week or so. Next week, we're taking a detailed look at issues affecting the sector in relation to the cost of living crisis. We've got the charity bank with us, as we have the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who've been looking at it in relation to poverty. We're joined by the Welsh Confederation of Housing Associations, who've been exploring how Welsh housing associations have been coping with the cost of living crisis, and also joined by an architect's practice, WWA, the West Wadi Arcadis, who've been looking at it in relation to how do we sort of future-proof our homes through energy efficiency and fuel poverty. So if this is something that builds on your experience today, please do join us next Tuesday. And our last session this month is looking at pride in living in later life, where we're looking at a variety of issues in later life for people from the LGBTQ+ communities, putting the spotlight on the work of HONIC, Orbit, and Pride of Living in Leeds. And that thanks very much to Winkworth Sherwood for supporting us on that session. So all I can say, we're going to finish slightly earlier than planned. We will try and encourage our friends. I know Randall's been on the call, but we will encourage our friends from University of West, from Bristol, to join us at a future happy hour too. And all it leaves me to say is have a very pleasant evening, and nice to see you all.
Thank you very much. Take care. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks.